At 3:41 local time, the desert was still black. Then Camp Buehring lit up in one violent flash. A ballistic missile that had been in the air for nearly 8 minutes came down at roughly Mach 3.5. Seconds later, Patriot crews were already firing PAC-3 MSE interceptors into the night. 3 targets were destroyed in less than 40 seconds. But not all of them. One warhead punched into the helicopter maintenance area. Another slammed near the fuel line. The blast wave hit first, then the sound, then the fire. And while every eye was locked on the sky, Shahed 136 drones were already slipping in low from another direction, about 100 feet above the ground. Around 100 knots. Cheap, quiet, deadly. This was not just an attack. It was a calculated message. And what happened next turned that message into a receipt Iran could not ignore. If you want sharp cinematic breakdowns of modern warfare with real numbers, real systems, and real stakes, subscribe to the channel now, because this story gets even bigger from here. At 3:39 local time, a maintenance crew at Camp Buehring in northwestern Kuwait was working under floodlights beside an AH-64 Apache. Routine work, tools on the concrete, and engine panels open. Another war night that still felt one step removed from the blast zone. What nobody on that flight line knew was that 8.5 minutes earlier, Iranian ballistic missiles had already left their launchers and were now dropping through the last arc of their descent at more than Mach 3, fast enough to cross a mile in barely a second. Fast enough that by the time a man hears the impact, the damage is already done. At 3:40, the first warning ripped across the base. Sirens, shouted orders, boots pounding over packed sand and concrete as soldiers ran from barracks toward hardened shelters and whatever they had on. On the perimeter, a Patriot battery had already painted multiple ballistic tracks on a southeastern bearing, descending hard and closing fast. The system responded exactly the way it was built to respond. PAC-3 MSE interceptors came off the launchers in pairs, white exhaust flashing across the desert floor like a row of camera strobes. At combined closing speeds above Mach 6, there is no need for a large blast. The missile itself becomes the hit. In less than 45 seconds, several inbound warheads were torn apart in the dark, but not all of them. One track survived, then another, and as the radar fought the geometry, trying to keep up with targets falling almost straight down out of the night, the men on that Apache line were still exposed under open sky. What was coming next was no longer a warning, it was impact. The first impact hit at 3:42, not the sound first, the pressure. A hard wall of force rolled across the helicopter maintenance area and slapped metal, canvas, glass, and bone in the same instant. One surviving warhead came down just off the flight line and turned the concrete into a cloud of dust, sparks, and shattered equipment. 2 Apache fuselages were ripped open by fragments. A section of the hangar buckled inward. Tool carts flipped. Fuel hoses snapped loose and whipped across the ground like cables under tension. Then the second strike landed closer to the support zone. And this one changed the whole picture. Jet fuel does not erupt like a movie fireball. It blooms, it spreads, it pushes a rolling orange front outward faster than a man can sprint, then lifts a column of black smoke high enough to mark the base from miles away. In less than a minute, parts of Camp Buehring looked less like a forward operating site and more like a refinery accident in the dark. But here is where the math gets ugly. While Patriot crews were locked onto ballistic tracks dropping out of the southeast, 3 Shahed 136 drones had already been crawling in from the south for roughly 40 minutes, about 95 feet above the ground, barely 105 knots, wingspan just over 3 meters, small enough on radar to blur into ground clutter, cheap enough to be expendable, precise enough to matter. Think about that. A system built to smash descending warheads at extreme speed was now being forced to deal with something slower than a highway car and lower than a power line. The Patriot was not failing. It was being pulled toward the loudest threat while a quieter one came in through the side door. At 3:43, one Shahed 136 struck near the command section. Lights cut, coordination slowed, burning debris scattered across the operations area. Camp Buehring was still under attack. And a few miles away, on another runway in the Kuwaiti desert, the answer to that attack was already starting to move. By 3:50, Camp Buehring was still burning. The helicopter line was lit by secondary fires. A fuel-fed glow was hanging over the base like a second sunrise that had arrived 2 hours too early. Black smoke was climbing into the pre-dawn dark in a column wide enough to be seen from the next sector of desert. The attack had lasted only minutes, The answer was already on the runway. At Ahmed Al-Jaber Air Base, 4 F-15E Strike Eagles were sitting armed for deep strike. Not patrol loadouts, not warning shots. This was a heavy response package. GBU-31 JDAMs hung under the fuselage stations. GBU-39 small-diameter bombs lined the wing racks. Across the 4 jets, the formation was carrying close to 90,000 pounds of aircraft, fuel, and guided ordnance committed to one purpose: find who launched the strike. Hit them before they disappeared. The F-15E Strike Eagle was built for nights exactly like this. Twin Pratt and Whitney F-100 engines, nearly 29,000 pounds of thrust each in. Afterburner, top speed beyond Mach 2 at altitude. Combat radius stretching deep enough to reach the coast, work the target area, and come back with margin left in the tanks. A 2-seat aircraft designed to fly into dangerous airspace, solve targeting problems in the dark, and leave wreckage behind. At 0352, ground crews cleared the last safety pins. Canopies locked. Taxi lights cut across the concrete. Then the throttles went forward. Afterburners turned the ramp orange. Each jet shoved more than 58,000 pounds of thrust into the Kuwaiti night. Heat distortion rolled behind them. The pavement shook. Loose grit danced across the edge of the runway. One after another, the Strike Eagles lifted off heavy, fast, and climbing northeast. Wheels up by 3:55. But the problem waiting for them was already changing shape. The MQ-9 feed had captured the launch area when the Iranian ballistic missiles left their rails. Useful, but not current. By the time Rage Flight was airborne, the transporter erector launchers had been moving for nearly 13 minutes, at relocation speeds between 35 and 45 miles per hour. That meant stale coordinates and a widening uncertainty box. The men who had hit Camp Buehring were no longer where they had fired from. They were on the road, and somewhere ahead of them, in the dark between the coast and the hills, the hunt was already becoming a race. The first map point was already old. The MQ-9 had seen the launch site. It had watched the missile rails flash. It had tracked the first minutes of movement after launch. Then the convoy slipped behind broken terrain and low coastal ridgelines, and the clean picture turned into a search problem. Not a full grid, not a precise fix, a corridor. Rage Flight pushed inland with that corridor on the data link and very little room for delay. The Iranian launchers were believed to be heading toward a tunnel complex in the coastal hills, roughly 4 kilometers ahead of their last reliable track. At convoy speeds near 40 miles per hour, every minute mattered. Every extra turn of the wheels shortened the time window. If the TELs made it underground, the hunt got longer, colder, and far more expensive. That was where the F-15E's sensor suite had to earn its keep. Under Rage 01, the Sniper Advanced Targeting Pod was already scanning ahead, looking for heat instead of light. At 20 miles, it could tell the crew that something out there was warm. An engine block, a truck, maybe the launcher, maybe the wrong vehicle entirely. That was not enough. A thermal glow is not positive identification, and positive identification is the line between a clean strike and the wrong headline the next morning. So the formation started working the problem the hard way. Altitude came down in controlled steps, from the mid-20s to the high teens, then lower still. Resolution sharpened with every mile cut off the slant range. The shapes below began to separate from the terrain. Road from wash, truck from rock, heat plumed from background dust. Then something flashed across the warning gear. A short radar hit. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Just enough for the ALR-56M to tell the crew that something on the ground was awake. Not firing yet, just watching. Somewhere between Rage Flight and the fleeing TELs, an air defense crew had started to look up. And that meant the chase was no longer just about getting to the launchers first. Now it was about surviving the road in. The radar hit belonged to a Tor M1, a self-contained mobile SAM, search radar, tracking radar, 8 ready missiles, all on one chassis. No big command van to hunt. No separate radar truck to isolate. Just one armored box sitting between Rage Flight and the TELs, doing exactly what it had been built to do. Keep the launchers alive for a few more minutes. That was the problem. The F-15Es were not carrying AGM-88 harm. They had bombs. They had the APG-82. They had the sniper pod. But to kill the Tor M1, they first needed it to talk long enough to give away its address. At 4:13, Rage 01 started down. Not a reckless dive, a deliberate press. Nose lowered from roughly 24,000 feet towards 16,000. Closing range, cutting angles, making the threat picture sharper for both sides. On the Tor Commander's scope, That move meant one thing. The American jet was coming closer to the corridor, protecting the launchers. If he stayed dark, the Strike Eagle would get the resolution it needed and the TELs would die without resistance. If he went active, he might get a shot. He chose to fire. The fire control radar snapped on in a hard, continuous track. This time it stayed up. 5 seconds, then 6. That was enough. Rage 01's WSO had the solution building almost immediately, triangulating the emission into a GPS quality fix while the pilot held the jet just inside the edge of danger. A missile came off the tour rail at nearly Mach 2.5 and started climbing fast. The F-15E broke hard left, dumped chaff, and dropped altitude in a violent descending turn that bled the geometry just enough to spoil the shot. 7 seconds later, a GBU-39 arrived at the tour's last known position. $40,000 of guided steel ended a system worth well over $20 million. The road opened instantly. With the air defense screen gone, sniper pod resolution cleaned up in seconds. 2 hot vehicles appeared in a wadi less than a kilometer from the tunnel entrance. Long, chassis, launcher canisters still mounted. No time left to hide. The first TEL took a GBU-39 at the rail junction and folded into burning wreckage. The second got the heavier answer. A GBU-31 JDAM dropped through the dark and erased the truck, the road surface, and everything parked near it. The launchers were gone, and with them, the strike that hit Camp Buehring had just lost its escape route, its shield, and its future. By 4:28, the strike that had started with fire over Camp Buehring was ending in fire on the other side of the Gulf. The TELs were gone, the Tor M1 was gone, and the command network behind the attack was no longer untouchable. Rage Flight turned south and kept working. The same chain that had launched ballistic missiles and pushed Shahed 136 drones toward an American base was now exposed. Not everywhere, not all at once, but enough. Enough for a response measured in precision instead of noise. Additional strikes hit the command compound tied to the launch operation. A communications node was torn open. A vehicle yard was left burning. Storage areas were hit hard enough to send a smoke column rising for thousands of feet into the morning air. In less than 50 minutes from the first impacts at Camp Buehring, the attack cell that had started this sequence had lost launchers, air defense cover, mobility, and control. And that is the part that matters, because this story is not really about who landed the first hit. It is about who could still see clearly after the first hit landed. Iran's attack was real. It was coordinated. It exploited timing, direction, altitude, and cost. For a few minutes, it worked. But in my view, this is where the larger picture turns. Modern war does not only reward the side that can launch missiles, it rewards the side that can close the loop faster. Find, track, decide, strike, then strike again before the other side has finished moving. That is what changed the weight of this exchange. One side created a flash, the other side turned that flash into a trail, and then followed that trail all the way back to the source. So here's the question. When you look at an exchange like this, what matters more to you? The opening blow, or the speed and precision of the answer that comes after it? Do you think a successful first strike is enough to claim momentum? Or does momentum belong to the side that can absorb the shock, rebuild the picture, and remove the people who planned it? I want to hear your view in the comments.